All right, everybody. How are you doing? We are about 2 months away from the election. Less than 2 months, I guess, depending how you quantify the total number of days in each month. But it now seems the most pressing question being asked, somewhat belatedly, is about whether the recent spate of riots, and to call them a spate is a vast understatement, the historic eruption of riots since the beginning of the summer will help Trump. And intuition would lead you to believe that they probably would, especially because Trump is running on a platform of law and order, which he tweets out in all caps regularly. And you have other dynamics, such as the media chronically underplaying the severity and scale of the riots. And so for Trump to now be more forcefully highlighting the actual damage caused by the riots almost gives him an air of truth telling. Like the true nature of the riots has been covered up, and so it's fallen to Trump to actually give the raw story as to what really has been going on. And there's a universe in which you can see that redounding to the political benefit of Trump and bolstering his electoral hopes, but I'm frankly not so sure. Number one, there's not a straightforward binary answer to this question, yes or no. It's possible amongst some voters, it could help. It's possible that Trump will lose, but he was still, quote, helped around the margins by the existence of riots. It's possible he could win, but it had nothing to do with the riots, or the effect of the riots was negligible. You got to bear in mind that elections are enormously multivariate affairs. So you have almost an infinite confluence of factors that combine to give rise to whatever the outcome may happen to be. And isolating those variables for the purposes of analysis or of journalistic explication is very complicated. You might even say impossible. However, I can provide some impressionistic accounts of what my sense is based on 2 months, as you know, traveling across the US, talking to people who were directly impacted by the riots. And by the way, I was just thinking about this in the past day or two, but I tentatively am planning on doing another trip in the run up to the election, probably in October, to some swing states, to use a cliche, and basically do a repeat of what I had done in 2016 when I went around to Pennsylvania, Ohio, North Carolina, etc., and reported on the election from the standpoint of just trying to get the views of ordinary people that I happen to randomly encounter. Um, and I kind of thought that over the summer, reporting on the riot slash COVID in a way would be a proxy for ascertaining people's political attitudes from which you can extrapolate what their voting preferences might be. But I do think that in the lead up to the actual election day, voter attention will crystallize on the election, um, such that you can talk to people more explicitly about the campaign rather than using proxy issues as sort of a window into what is informing their sentiments as voters. So don't have a firm plan on that yet, but I will keep you updated as usual. And if you have any suggestions for where I might go, what I might do, and so on, feel free to drop me a line. I think it would, I guess, make the most sense to go to Pennsylvania, Michigan, Wisconsin, Minnesota. But then again, I don't know. Arizona might be interesting. So we'll see. But that aside, having been completed, how do we think about this question of whether the riots help Trump? Well, I don't purport to have a conclusive answer. And there's a whole lot of complexities having to do with the multivariate nature of elections. But I can say, and I wrote about this in the column for the New York Daily News this week, which I will link to in the description box as usual. I will say that over the course of those 2 months, people who I encountered who were directly impacted by the riots, most of whom had a negative view of the riots, even if they were even in some sense sympathetic with whatever their notion of Black Lives Matter was, or the protest movement writ large, and some maybe who were not, I didn't hear a single of them proactively mention that they were now motivated to vote for Trump, where they otherwise would not have been. And I would have expected to hear some of that if it was as significant of a dynamic as people now are seeming to believe it is. Not that my experiences could possibly be perfectly representative of the entire electorate. That's not possible. That's not what I'm claiming is the case. If you want statistically representative samples of the electorate, then you have to delve into polling, and that has its own set of ambiguities and complexities. But there is such a thing, I would think, or I believe, I assert, as anecdotal data or experiential data that if you're able to have multiple thoughts in your head at once, you can formulate into some kind of rendering of the attitudes of the electorate that also incorporates quantitative data like polling. So it's got to be an all of the above approach because we live in a country with 330 million, and it's fruitless to say that you can never have a fully all-encompassing sense of the trends that might be operative within the electorate on any given election year. Um, so I didn't. So in Illinois and in Pennsylvania and in Minnesota and Wisconsin and other states, Oregon is sort of its own special case. I didn't encounter anybody who could have fit the profile of what you might call an undecided voter or a swing voter who seemed as though they were now going to be more motivated to vote for Trump. And so I think this easy inference that you see some mostly from conservative pundits that, oh, Trump has got this in the bag now because there were riots in Kenosha. I don't know that that really squares with the reality, or at least the reality as I perceived it in those 2 months that I was there. Now, I haven't been to Kenosha. I haven't been to any really real protest zones in now a month or more. So maybe things have shifted somewhat. Maybe as the election approaches, people will connect their riot experiences more explicitly with their election preferences. But as yet, I just don't have an empirical basis to conclude the riots will necessarily help Trump. And I think part of that stems from one fundamental change from that is observable, readily observable in this election compared to 2016, which is that the electorate is far less volatile. Now, I pulled up a post that I wrote on my Medium page. I guess I will link to that as well in the description box from this week 4 years ago. And I want to give you a brief summary of what I wrote in that piece, and that was August 31st, 2016. And here's what the polling indicated on August 31st, 2016. I'm not saying polling is perfect. I'm not saying it should be viewed without skepticism. So I don't need the polling truthers inundating me with that kind of retort. However, there were polls in this week, 2016, which found that approximately a quarter of all voters said that they were either undecided or stated a preference for a third party candidate. Now think about that. 25% roughly of the electorate this time in 2016 was either undecided or at least stated that they favored a third party candidate. That meant that the election was volatile. If you have that high a percentage of voters who could possibly swing in one or another directions, that meant there could be events like debates, like this didn't happen in 2016, but like, for example, a wave of riots, like Hillary Clinton's email server investigation being reopened suddenly just before the election, like the Access Hollywood tape that came out on Trump, like WikiLeaks emails, like a whole range of potential unforeseen events popping up that could really have a significant effect on voter preference because there was fluidity there or volatility. This year, the electorate is just far less volatile. Far fewer undecided voters, far fewer voters who state a preference for a third party candidate. And so I don't think that individual discrete events, like a riot, are necessarily going to have anywhere near as tangible effect on the broad sweep of the electorate as a lot of pundits theorize. I think simply that the electorate is so much more polarized and you might even say radicalized that it's just not amenable to sudden jolts and shifts. in the same way that it was in 2016. And the whole point of my writing this article 4 years ago was the following. Here's the headline: Volatility and why Trump's odds of victory are higher than popularly assumed. So I was pointing out that dynamic in 2016 to add a corrective to what was then the pundit consensus, which is that Trump had no chance. I wasn't saying in that piece that I was predicting Trump would win, because I don't make firm predictions like that. It's stupid. But I was saying, look, here are variables X, Y, and Z, which should play a much bigger role in our assessments of what the state of the race is. And now, 4 years later, it's sort of reverted back to the mean, where you don't have the volatility. And, in an extraordinarily close race, could you have certain discrete events maybe affecting the outcome? Yeah, but as of now, the race doesn't seem extraordinarily close, or at least not as close as it was in 2016. We can go through the reasons for that, and there are many, but for the purpose of this topic, it makes it less likely that the riots would necessarily have as outsized of an impact as a lot of people seem to suspect. If you're one of the people chanting rah rah, who is extremely certain that riots will have an impact, ask yourself what selection bias you are representative of. Are you a truly undecided voter? Do you think the average undecided voter is going to be commenting on my dopey little YouTube chat? Is the average undecided voter going to spend hours each day fighting about politics online? Probably not. So, my doubt about whether the riots actually do advantage Trump stems from an awareness of how the fundamentals of the election have changed over the course of 4 years. And also, there's sort of more ethereal reasons that are a little bit more speculative but still might be relevant. Which is that in 2016, often what you heard in why voters preferred Trump was that they wanted to shake up the system. They wanted to, even in some cases, blow up the system. They were sick of the political establishment on a bipartisan basis, whom they felt they were getting screwed over by or was not responsive to their needs. Trump stepped into that void as an entirely new figure, at least within the context of two-party politics. He'd taken over the Republican Party in this hostile takeover, and then he dislodged the reigning dynasty in the Republican Party, the Bushes, and then he was up against the reigning dynasty in the Democratic Party, the Clintons, and through that he could channel transpartisan anti-establishment energies. Whereas in 2020, Trump is now firmly enmeshed in the political status quo. It's merely by dint of being the president. It doesn't mean that certain tendencies or traits of his that compelled voters in 2016 to support him on the basis of that anti-establishment fervor might not still have some impact 4 years later, notwithstanding him being the president. Although there's a certain paradoxical element to that. But it means it's going to be less, I think, potent in 2020 than it was in 2016. Hence the dramatic shift in Trump's messaging, where he tries to castigate Biden out in heavily ideologized terms, like he is the Trojan horse for the radical left. I mean, correct me if I'm wrong, and I'm sure there was some of this in 2016, but the broad thrust of Trump's messaging against Hillary was not that she was a Trojan horse for the radical left, or really that she was, you know, gonna bring in Marxists or anything like that. It was that she was the emblem of a decadent, corrupt political system, and that critique had some grounding in reality. I mean, Hillary kind of was that. Whereas in 2020, I mean, the idea that Biden is a Trojan horse of the radical left is just far less plausible. I now have people telling me why that is actually true, but leave aside the esoteric debates over whether that may or may not be true in some removed sense. I'm comfortable saying it's far less plausible than the critique of Hillary as being an emblem for a failed status quo. And how does that interface with the riot question? Well, I mean, if you are against riots, you want a stabilizing force to intervene. And if the logic for Trump's candidacy the last time was that he was a disruptor of sorts, then the whole idea was that he was anti-stabilizing. He was going to destabilize an oppressively stifling status quo. And so I don't know how that really works as insofar as trying to paint Trump as the counterweight to destabilizing street protest / riot activity. It just doesn't quite fit in the same way. And on top of that, Trump, I think you'll find, if you are honest, is often viewed as an agent of chaos in his own right. Now, largely that owes to his communication style. I mean, the one thing that really is distinct about Trump's entire presidency is his communication style is just off the wall in terms of how significant a departure it is from his predecessors. But a lot of the policy stuff is roughly contiguous with the predecessors. Again, I'm oversimplifying. There are certain examples of where it is a departure, but in the main, we have largely a continuation of the status quo in terms of the policy portfolio, foreign and domestic. But in terms of sorry about that. But in terms of the communication style, it's a massive departure. And I got to end the stream now, but I made my point, more or less. Sorry if I missed any of your super chats. Read the New York Daily News column for the full argument being made here. And that's just my analysis. Again, I try to separate the analysis from the normative, and I've been over that distinction in the past. But if people don't want to acknowledge it, so be it. All right, stay safe, stay cool, etc.